On a freezing winter night, a young black waitress, struggling to care for her sick father, discovered a homeless boy curled up in an alley. Despite facing discrimination and the threat of losing her job, she chose to feed him and keep him warm. Unbeknownst to her, every act of kindness was quietly watched by a once struggling billionaire. One unexpected envelope would change her life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. It was one of those bitter January nights in Memphis, where the wind scraped the skin and even the streetlights flickered like they were too cold to stand tall. The diner sat on the corner of Beale and Jefferson, old brick walls, faded neon sign buzzing faintly, and a steady stream of tired souls coming in to escape the cold. Inside it smelled like burnt coffee and fryer grease. The booths were worn thin, the countertop chipped, and the jukebox hadn't worked since 2009. But for some folks, it was the only warm place left in a city that didn't care much for the forgotten. Clara James pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. She was 24, small-framed, with deep brown skin and tired eyes that had seen more than most women her age. Her black curls were tied back in a loose bun, damp from the sleet outside, and her uniform, an old pale yellow waitress dress with a fraying name tag, hung awkwardly on her from too many skipped meals. The other waitress on shift, a blonde girl named Katie, barely looked up when Clara entered. The cook in the back, a heavy-set man with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, just grunted. Clara's presence didn't go unnoticed, though. A man in a suit at the front counter gave her a once-over and shook his head like she'd tracked something in. Two older women in a booth near the window pulled their handbags closer to their side. A pair of teenagers snickered. It wasn't loud, but Clara caught it. She always did. The looks, the tight smiles, the way they called her girl instead of her name. She'd grown used to it. Not numb, never numb, but practiced. She clocked in without a word, tied her apron, and moved with quiet precision to bus a table near the back. She was just about to refill the sugar jars when she saw it. Movement outside near the dumpster, just beyond the glow of the outdoor bulb. She squinted through the foggy window. There was someone there, hunched low in the shadows, barely more than a bundle of fabric. No one else noticed. No one else looked. Clara hesitated, glanced at the boss behind the register who was busy counting bills, then slipped off her apron and headed for the back door. The cold slapped her in the face as she stepped outside. Steam rose from her breath as she walked toward the alley, boots crunching on patches of half-frozen slush. Near the trash bins, a boy, no older than 7, was curled up against the wall, wrapped in a filthy blanket that didn't even cover his knees. His skin was pale, lips cracked, and eyes sunken from hunger. He flinched when Clara approached, his small hands tightening around the fabric like he thought she'd take it from him. "Hey there," she said softly, kneeling beside him. Her voice was warm but low, the kind of tone that made people stop bracing for pain. He didn't answer, just stared wide-eyed, breathing fast through his nose. Clara slowly extended a hand, not to touch, just to show she wasn't a threat. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you. You hungry?" His head twitched in a tiny nod, then looked away like he was ashamed to admit it. Clara glanced back at the diner. No one was looking. No one cared. She turned back to the boy and offered her hand again. "Come on, let's get you something hot to eat. My treat." He hesitated. Then, slowly, his fingers reached for hers. So small, so cold it made her flinch. She helped him up carefully, like he might break if she moved too fast. Back inside, heads turned as they entered. The man in the suit frowned. The teenagers laughed again. Someone muttered something under their breath about bringing that kind in here. Clara didn't flinch. She guided the boy to a booth in the back and sat him down, moving quickly to grab a menu, though she didn't. "You like grilled cheese and tomato soup?" she asked with a smile. He nodded, barely above a whisper. "Perfect choice," she said, brushing a damp curl from his forehead. "I'll be right back." She moved to the kitchen, ignoring the looks. Behind her, in a corner of the diner where the light was dimmest, a man sat alone at a booth, stirring his coffee slowly. His gray beard was trimmed neat, his clothes quiet but expensive. Mr. Wallace had been coming to the diner every Tuesday for weeks. Most thought he was just another retired professor, or maybe a writer. No one knew he had once been one of the wealthiest men in the Southeast, and no one knew he'd been watching Clara since the day he overheard her offer an extra biscuit to a homeless veteran who couldn't afford coffee. He watched now as she returned to the boy's table, setting down a hot bowl of tomato soup and a sandwich oozing with melted cheese. "There you go, kiddo," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "No rush, just eat." The boy gripped the spoon like it might disappear. His lips trembled as he took the first sip. The warmth hit him like a wave, and for the first time his shoulders dropped. Clara saw it. The moment, relief broke through hunger. And Mr. Wallace saw it too. He took a slow sip of coffee, never breaking his gaze. Tonight he hadn't come for the food. He'd come for her. The next evening the cold had only deepened, pressing against the cracked windows of the diner like a warning. A thin frost had settled on the edges of the glass, and Clara's fingers stung every time she touched a metal surface. The streets outside were nearly empty, too cold for anyone to linger. But inside the diner, the heat and hum of conversation created a strange kind of warmth, the kind that didn't quite reach the bone. Clara moved between tables with practiced ease, though her legs ached and her back begged for rest. Her shoes were still damp from the walk to work. She'd wrapped her feet in old socks to keep out the cold, but it hadn't helped much. She poured refills of black coffee, wiped down ketchup-smeared tables, and offered tired smiles to customers who rarely looked her in the eye. Most were regulars, older white men with weathered hands, local contractors who spoke to Katie with friendly jokes but rarely said more than "refill" to Clara. She didn't take it personally anymore. She couldn't afford to. She felt the shift in air before she saw him. An older man sitting just outside the diner's front entrance, crouched low against the brick wall with a torn sign held to his chest. Hungry. Anything helps. His hands were red from the cold, cracked at the knuckles, and his coat was more whole than fabric. Clara stared through the glass for a long second, her fingers tightening around the edge of the coffee pot. No one inside noticed him, or maybe they did, but chose not to. She glanced toward the register. Gus, the owner, was hunched over receipts, muttering about inventory. Katie was in the back chatting up a delivery guy. Clara slipped off her apron and walked out the side door, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the familiar weight of the choice she was about to make. The man looked up as she approached. His eyes were pale and cloudy, maybe from age, maybe from something deeper. Clara crouched beside him and pulled a few crumpled bills from her apron pocket, tips from the last 3 tables. "Here," she said quietly, placing the bills into his hand. "Get something warm tonight, please." He stared at her, his lips trembling. "You don't know what this means." Clara offered a tired smile. "I think I do." When she returned inside, the warmth didn't feel comforting, it felt suffocating. The laughter from one of the booths grated against her ears. She forced herself back into the rhythm of the shift, clearing plates and ignoring the cold sweat that clung to her lower back. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time inside the diner blurred easily. She was just finishing up a booth near the back when she noticed them. A woman and her daughter, maybe 6 or 7, seated near the window. The little girl whispered into her mother's sleeve, her eyes darting toward the menu. The mother, thin and pale, bit her lip and subtly shook her head. Clara had seen this moment before. The long pause over the cheapest items, the silent mental math, the hope that maybe, just maybe, they had enough for one plate to share. Clara didn't think twice. She turned on her heel and made her way to the kitchen, where a stack of uneaten burger patties and fries sat cooling on the counter. She grabbed a paper bag and packed the food quickly, hands moving with the quiet urgency of someone used to hiding her intentions. She walked over to their table with the bag tucked close to her chest. "On the house," she whispered, placing it gently in front of them before they could object. The mother looked up, startled. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Clara didn't wait for thanks, she simply walked away. But in the corner of her eye she saw the woman press the bag against her chest like it was more than food, like it was dignity returned. From his usual booth, Mr. Wallace saw everything. He watched as Clara went back to her cleaning like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just handed someone a lifeline. He also saw Gus storm out from the back hallway, a clipboard in one hand, jaw tight with frustration. Clara didn't see him coming. "Elizabeth," Gus barked. He always used her first name like it was a curse. Clara straightened up, napkin still clutched in one hand. "Yes, sir?" "You giving away food again?" She opened her mouth, closed it. There was no use lying. It was just leftovers. "Leftovers," he repeated, voice rising with mockery. "That's what you call a burger and fresh fries now?" Clara met his gaze, calm but unwavering. "They weren't going to be served. I made sure of that." "This is a business, not your personal soup kitchen," Gus snapped. "You keep handing out free meals like that and I'll start docking your pay." Clara's jaw tensed. She looked past him, toward the table where the mother was now quietly feeding her daughter a handful of fries, the girl smiling softly for the first time all night. Clara turned back to Gus. "Then dock it," she said. "If it comes out of my pay, fine. People need it more than I do." Gus stared at her like she'd just spoken another language. Then he shook his head in disgust and walked away, muttering under his breath. The diner was quieter after that, though the air felt heavier. Katie shot Clara a sideways glance, but didn't say anything. Mr. Wallace, however, leaned forward just slightly in his booth. His hands were folded over his coffee mug. There was a subtle shift in his expression. Not surprise, not pity, admiration maybe. Or recognition? Clara returned to the back counter and resumed wiping down menus, the tension still coiled in her shoulders. She didn't regret what she'd done. Not the money, not the confrontation, not even the looks from other customers. But something inside her was starting to bend. It was the kind of bend that came from giving too much for too long without anyone ever giving back. And still, she knew she'd do it again. She always would. Because at the end of the night, when the last coffee cup was washed and the chairs were flipped onto tables, she still remembered what it felt like to be the one sitting outside in the cold, invisible. And someone needed to remember. The wind had only grown harsher by Thursday night. It screamed through the alley beside the diner and rattled the loose siding like angry fingers tapping at the building's edge. Inside, the heat fought to keep up. The radiator near the kitchen groaned like it was on its last breath. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow as she stepped out of the walk-in cooler, arms full of restocked milk cartons. Her breath was visible every time the back door opened, and her hands felt raw from exposure to cold and dishwater. The shift was slower than usual, but somehow it dragged longer. She had worked a double. Opened at sunrise, and she'd close after midnight. Her back throbbed, her calves cramped with every step, and her fingers wouldn't stop shaking. Her father's medications were running low again, and the clinic had sent a final notice. Clara tried not to think about it. There was always another shift, another dollar to stretch, always something to push past. As she poured coffee for the 2 truckers in booth 3, she heard the door open behind her. She turned instinctively and froze. Sitting on one of the stools at the counter, swinging his legs, was the boy from earlier in the week, Noah. His blanket was gone, replaced by a threadbare hoodie far too small for the freezing temperature. His cheeks were bright red, his hands pressed between his knees, and his eyes searched the room as if looking for someone familiar. When he spotted Clara, he smiled. A small, worn smile that broke her heart all over again. She crossed the room without thinking. "Hey, kid," she said gently, crouching beside the stool. "You okay? You out here by yourself again?" He nodded, but his lips were chapped and his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Clara didn't press. She simply unzipped her jacket, the only decent one she owned, and wrapped it around his tiny shoulders without a second thought. "You can't keep showing up out here like this," she whispered, voice cracking. "It's too damn cold." Noah didn't say anything. He just leaned into the warmth of the jacket, like it was the only safe thing left in the world. From the far corner of the diner, Mr. Wallace watched the scene unfold. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stirred his coffee with slow, measured movements and kept his eyes on Clara. He'd seen her give up tips, risk her job, get humiliated in front of a half-old diner, and now she was giving away the only jacket she had. Without hesitation. It wasn't pity that moved her, it wasn't performative. It came from something deeper, something harder to name. Clara stood up and rubbed her arms, already feeling the cold settling in. The heater behind the counter wasn't working again. Her boss had promised to get it fixed, but she knew he wouldn't. She looked at Noah, then at the clock, then quietly disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a plate of chicken tenders and fries. No one stopped her. No one even asked. "Eat up, all right," she said, setting the plate down in front of him. Noah's eyes lit up, and he dug in quickly, like he wasn't sure how long it would last. Clara turned back toward the register when she heard Gus call out from behind the counter, voice low but venomous, "My office, now." She clenched her jaw, exhaled slowly, then walked past the fryer and into the small back room. The door closed behind her with a thud. Gus was already pacing. "I've had it," he snapped. "You think I don't see what you're doing, every damn shift. You're feeding strays, giving out coffee, taking in kids like this is your personal rescue mission." Clara didn't say anything at first. She waited, heart pounding, waiting for the moment he'd finish the speech he seemed to rehearse nightly. "You want to give charity?" he continued. "Do it on your own time. This is a business, Clara. People pay to eat here. You don't just decide who eats for free." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream that it was her time, that every hour in this place was her life passing by, that she hadn't sat down for a meal herself in days, that she gave everything she had and no one even noticed. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice steady. "Take it out of my check." Gus narrowed his eyes. "You serious? Every time. Dock me. I don't care. But I'm not going to sit here and throw away food while there's a kid outside freezing," he sneered. "You think you're some kind of saint?" "No," she replied, the heat rising behind her eyes. "I think I'm someone who remembers what it feels like to be ignored." The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy. Gus shook his head, muttered something she didn't catch, and stormed past her, slamming the door as he left. Clara stayed there for a beat longer, her breath catching, her shoulders trembling. Not from fear, but from the ache of being so tired, so angry and so alone in doing the right thing. When she finally walked back into the diner, Mr. Wallace was standing at the counter. He hadn't been there a minute ago. He looked at her quietly for a long moment. She noticed his eyes weren't cold like the others, they were searching, almost hesitant. "Why do you do this?" he asked. His voice was deep, calm, but laced with something older. Pain, maybe. Or memory. Clara blinked. "Do what?" He gestured toward the room, the boy, the half-eaten plate of food. "All of it. Why?" She hesitated. She could have given a dozen answers. "It's the right thing. He's just a kid." Because no one else will. But none of those fit the ache in her chest, the weariness behind her eyes. So instead she just said what came from the only part of her that still felt alive. "Because if I don't," she said, barely above a whisper, "then who will?" There was a flicker in Wallace's face. His shoulders tightened, and his jaw moved like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small brown envelope. He placed it on the counter without a word. Clara looked down at it, confused. "What is this?" He didn't answer. He just stepped back, nodded again, and walked out into the freezing dark. Clara stood behind the counter, breath catching in her throat, staring at the envelope as if it might vanish. Her hands didn't move. She felt numb. She didn't know what was inside. She only knew something was about to change. But not tonight. Tonight, she'd still finish her shift. Tonight, she'd still walk home with wet socks. But now, there was a weight in her hand that felt strangely like hope. The apartment was dark except for the dull yellow light coming from the single bulb over the kitchen sink. Clara sat at the wobbly table, elbows on the formica surface, head in her hands. The envelope Mr. Wallace had left still lay untouched in front of her, its brown paper worn soft around the edges. She hadn't opened it after her shift. She hadn't even let herself wonder too much about it. She was too tired for hope. Her father coughed softly from the back bedroom, a low, dry sound that made her flinch. She stood, grabbed the bottle of cough syrup from the cabinet and patted down the hallway. The heater hadn't kicked in all day, and the air inside felt like cold dust. Her father was curled under 2 blankets, his face pale, lips tinged with blue. She eased down beside him, lifted his head gently, and helped him take a sip of water. "You working late again tomorrow?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, smoothing the blanket over his chest. "Yeah, double shift. Should be a busy weekend." He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes were watery, his face thinner than she remembered even a week ago. "You're doing too much, Clara." She smiled faintly, pressing her fingers around his. Not enough. Not yet. When he drifted back to sleep, she returned to the kitchen, the envelope still waiting. She sat back down, stared at it, tapped her fingers nervously on the table. Something about it unsettled her. Not in a bad way, just in a way she couldn't name. Finally, she reached for the flap and peeled it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper. And a check. She pulled the check out first. Her breath caught, her vision blurred. She blinked again, holding the check closer, mouth falling open. The amount wasn't just generous, it was unimaginable. More than she'd ever made in 5 years of waiting tables. Enough to pay off her father's hospital bills, fix up the apartment, cover rent for a year, maybe more. It wasn't a donation. It was freedom printed on smooth white paper. She choked on a sob that rose without warning. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the note tucked inside. It was short, just 1 sentence. "Kindness matters. Keep doing what you do." There was no signature, no explanation. But she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was from. Her whole body sank into the chair as the weight of it hit her. Not just the money, though that was enough to change everything. But the truth that someone had seen her, really seen her. Not just the tired girl in a cheap apron, not just another broke waitress scraping tips, but the part of her that refused to give up on people. Someone had looked at that and instead of dismissing it, had decided it was worth something. The sob finally broke free and she covered her mouth with one hand, the other still clinging to the check like it might disappear. It had been so long since something good happened without a price. Too long. When she could breathe again, she stood up and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the street was dark and quiet, the pavement wet from an earlier rain. Somewhere out there, Wallace had walked away without waiting for thanks. And she'd probably never see him again. But what he'd done, what he'd given, was bigger than just money. It was a second chance, a first chance, really. The next few days passed in a haze. She took her father to the hospital, handed over the check to the billing office, and watched the clerk's eyes widen as the account cleared. She bought groceries without checking the prices twice, replaced her father's coat, got her own jacket back from Noah, though she told him to keep it as a backup. He had started showing up every day now, not just for food, but for safety, and Clara made sure he had both. But it wasn't until she walked into the diner on Monday morning, holding a set of legal documents in her hand, that it truly felt real. Gus was already behind the counter, sipping coffee and grumbling to himself about the busted register. When he saw her walk in wearing clean jeans and a warm sweater instead of her usual uniform, he raised an eyebrow. "You finally quit?" he muttered. "No," she said, calmly, sliding the papers across the counter. "I bought the place." He squinted at the documents, read the signature at the bottom, and looked up slowly. "Come again?" "I'm buying the diner, Gus. Full transfer of ownership. You said last month you were thinking about selling." His mouth opened, then closed. "You? You serious?" "I am." He studied her, trying to find the trick, the angle, but there wasn't one. Finally, he gave a small laugh, The kind people make when they realize the world just shifted under their feet. "Well, I'll be damned," Clara smiled. Not out of pride, but out of something quieter. Relief. Completion. Within a week, the paperwork was finalized. The diner sign stayed the same for a little while, mostly because she didn't have time to change it. But everything inside started to shift. She gave the old man who used to beg outside a job bussing tables, hired a single mom named Janelle to run the morning shift. Every leftover plate was boxed and stored in a fridge labeled community shelf, no questions asked. She didn't run the place like a charity, she ran it like a promise. One night, near closing, she walked through the empty dining room, wiping down the booths just like she used to. The neon sign outside flickered softly, casting a red glow against the window. Behind the counter, Noah was sitting on a stool, sipping cocoa with his legs swinging. He wasn't so quiet now. He talked about school, about maybe getting a dog someday. He had a place to sleep. He had a name that people remembered. Clara had taken care of that, too. As she rinsed out the last coffee pot, she felt a strange stillness settle in her chest. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from finally not running anymore. She looked around and realized this was the first time she had stood still in years. The walls were still chipped, the booths still squeaked, the coffee machine still leaked, but it was hers, and it mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because every plate, every voice, every hand she reached for mattered. Just like someone once reminded her, kindness, she thought, drying her hands, had never been the problem. People forgetting it mattered, that was, but not here. Not anymore. The sun was setting behind the buildings of downtown Memphis, casting long amber streaks across the cracked sidewalk in front of the diner. The new sign above the door, Clara's Table, glowed softly in the dimming light, its freshly painted letters still smelling faintly of varnish. The smell of cornbread and coffee drifted through the air as Clara stepped outside, wiping her hands on a clean apron and leaning against the doorway to catch her breath. Inside, the last of the dinner rush was settling. The clatter of plates had quieted into soft conversation and laughter. Janelle was finishing up at the register, and Noah was sitting at the counter doing homework, his pencil tapping out a steady rhythm. Clara took in the moment slowly, breathing it in like warmth on a cold night. Across the street, beneath the fading orange of a broken street lamp, a man stood still. She saw him almost immediately. He didn't wave, didn't move, but there was no mistaking the long coat, the way he kept his hands in his pockets, the way he observed without needing to be part of the scene. Mr. Wallace. She hadn't seen him in months, not since the night he'd handed her an envelope and vanished into the dark. But she knew he'd been watching. She felt it in the quiet way some people still look for proof that the world can be better. Their eyes met across the street. She didn't say anything, neither did he, but something in the air shifted, like two pieces finally settling into place. Clara lifted one hand, a small wave, nothing dramatic. He nodded once, the faintest lift of his chin, then turned and disappeared into the crowd without a word. Clara stayed there a moment longer, heart full in a way that had nothing to do with money or success. It was something deeper, something rooted in every choice she'd made when no one was looking. She thought of all the nights she'd gone home cold and broke, of every time she'd chosen to care when it would have been easier not to. And now, here she stood. Not rescued, not made perfect, but seen. Behind her, someone called her name. A man in a heavy coat was sitting on the curb just beyond the reach of the diner lights, his hands shaking from the cold. Without hesitation, Clara picked up a plate she'd set aside earlier and walked toward him. "Here," she said, kneeling beside him, her voice as gentle as ever. "A warm meal always helps." The man looked up, surprised, eyes rimmed red from the wind. "Thank you," he whispered, hoarse with something more than cold. She smiled, rising slowly. "Any time." As she stepped back inside, the door chimed behind her, and the light above the counter cast a golden hue across the room. Clara glanced around, not at the repairs or the new tables, but at the people inside, at the quiet way they'd begun to believe again. She hadn't saved the world, but she'd kept one place warm, and sometimes that was enough. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.